as seen here, have little synapses, which is a gap between nerve cells. And that gap between nerve cells, chemicals have to be exchanged between them. Electricity doesn't flow between them. It has to be a chemical signal that then continues the cascade. And sodium is one of the primary chemicals used to exchange nerve impulses. There's also water balance. So whenever we add water to a solution with a membrane in it, for example, let's just imagine this is a cell in the center here. If there's a normal concentration of sodium, then everything's happy. The water level in the glass and in the cell is equalized. When we all of a sudden change the level of sodium in the glass so that there's an increased level of sodium in the glass, the cell shrinks because the water leaves the cell. This can cause cell death, or at least cell not functioning very well. When we change the level of sodium so that it's higher in the cell than the glass, the cell ruptures. It explodes, which causes cell death. But primarily, we're going to be talking about, oh, he's not looking. Sodium chloride. Natrium chloride. So Na, natrium, comes from the Latin word. That's why sodium is Na, but we pronounce it sodium. So NaCl, natrium chloride. So sodium chloride is the primary component of table salt. And if you have very pure table salt, it's the only component. But table salt isn't the only salt that we eat. There are other forms of salt. There's kosher salt. So what is kosher salt? Kosher salt is big and flaky, right? We all know kosher salt. The kosher salt that's sold in stores is typically pumped up from like brines, so they inject water into the ground and then pull it up from great salt mines and then dry it. And that's how you get big flaky salts, kosher salt. It typically doesn't have any iodine in it, and we'll talk about iodine. Iodine was used to prevent goiter. So everybody know what goiter is? It's an inflammation of the thyroid. It turns out that without iodine, the thyroid actually increases in size quite tremendously. And in fact, your thyroid can get huge. This wasn't considered a national health crisis until the early 1900s, about when a doctor from the University of Michigan noted he was working with the Army on candidates that were being denied because of selective service criteria. So in working with the Army, he found that a lot of young people were being rejected from the military because of thyroid disorders. And they were specific among certain areas of the United States. There were clumps of these. And at first he thought, well, maybe this is a paperwork error, or maybe they're just saying, oh no, thyroid issue, and never mind, you don't have to go. But this turned out to be true. There were clumps throughout the US of young people with a high rate of thyroid disorders. And that the thyroid disorders can actually exceeded in certain areas, certain clumps, 70% of kids had a thyroid disorder that was significant enough to discharge them from the service or to not meet selective service criteria. So in looking into this, he discovered that it was primarily caused by lack of iodine. So he proposed that we add iodine to salt in the form of another salt called either sodium iodide or potassium iodide. Sodium iodide doesn't exist? Has to be potassium. All right. Potassium iodide, which is another salt. It comes together to form a neutral compound. It's ionic. It's soluble in water. It's another salt. So in adding iodine to the salt, a tremendous number of goiter cases were relieved. So it went from 70% in some areas down to 4%. It was enormous change. And all this came about because of being rejected from the military. Let's talk about table salt. Table salt is the normal salt that we think of when we're at the dinner table, right? We probably all have it on the dinner table. Table salt contains iodine, and it's usually in small cubes. If you magnify table salt, you'll see that it's actually a really, really tiny cube. And that's different than kosher salt being big and flaky. Sea salt. Where do you think sea salt comes from? We do have a smart audience here. So sea salt obviously comes from the sea. It's made by evaporating the seawater. There's a couple different methods to do that. But I have some examples here of various salts, many of which are sea salt. So there's all kinds of different salts. Oh, I should. Yeah, I need a mic. Yep. No, I'm okay. I got it. I am going to need a mic later on, though, for our experiment. A Mike Winter for our experiment. So there's all kinds of different salts. I've had this in my kitchen for a couple of years, and occasionally we dip into it when we need a specialized salt. But I think about half those are sea salt. The other half are traditional mined salts. I suppose you could pass it around. Just don't drop it, please. It is a little heavy. So you can see all of these salts are sodium chloride as their primary component. So sea salt.
The difference between table salt and kosher salt, how do you define kosher salt?
So kosher salt derives its name from the Jewish koshering process of meat. Kosher salt is defined as large and flaky and does not have any iodine in it. Whereas table salt is small, cube-shaped, and typically does contain iodine. Typically iodized salt. So there's, go. I'm sorry? Uh-huh. Yes. So there are small contaminants in salt from dried up lake beds, but those are typically removed during the manufacturing process. Almost anything can be in there. So salt long ago, in areas where there was seawater, the seawater becomes isolated to form a lake, a salty lake, and then the sun slowly evaporates it. That leads to very large areas of salt on the surface or just under the surface. these become salt mines.
Is there a difference between mined salt and other salt, like sea salt or any other kind of salt? What's the advantage of having mined salt if you already have salt in other forms?
So the salt in other forms, like sea salt, takes a lot of energy to make, and salt in mines is readily accessible. So that's certainly the case with Himalayan sea salt, which isn't actually from Himalaya, the Himalayas. It's actually from Pakistan. But it's pink because of the impurities in it, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So there's two types of sea salt. There's fine sea salt. That's the sea salt that we all know and love, right? That's the normal type of sea salt. Regardless of the size of the grain, it's all called fine sea salt. Then there's flake sea salt. Flake sea salt is made in a different process, and it's much more expensive. Flake sea salt is made by putting ocean water in these thin pools and letting the sun, largely the sun, evaporate it, and mixing it from now and then to come up with these big flakes. Like, these flakes are huge. I don't have an example. It's really expensive salt. It's a manual process. Let's talk about Himalayan salt. Himalayan salt has some different characteristics to it. Usually it's bigger, and it's often pink. Why is it pink? Anybody know? Somebody said iron. You're absolutely right. It's iron oxide content. Iron oxide is the same reason that our blood is red. It turns the Himalayan sea salt a slightly rosy color. It's mined out of enormous mines. Even with all of the Himalayan sea salt that we have extracted as humanity, we've barely touched 1% of the available Himalayan sea salt. It's mined in huge chunks, like the size of a Volkswagen. And it's brought out in trucks and chopped up to put salt on our table and to make Himalayan sea salt lamps. Does anybody have one of these? Oh, a couple people have one of these. So the health benefits of Himalayan sea salt, it's sometimes talked about as having vitamins and minerals that you need, or not vitamin, it would be minerals though, that you need, but they're only in trace amounts. They're in very, very small amounts. Your body doesn't need a huge amount of iron, which is the sort of the primary contaminant in Himalayan sea salt. I guess it has 84 different sort of contaminants in it, but they're only in trace amounts, very, very small amounts. So the health benefits are somewhat dubious. Black salt. Black salt comes from or is contaminated by volcanoes. And volcanoes emit a lot of sulfur, and that's what contaminates black salt. It often smells like rotten eggs because of the sulfur content, but it's used in some specialty forms of some drinks or some specialty foods. You might see it at like a nice restaurant. It really has selective use. Probably one that you haven't heard of is flour salt. Flour salt is regular table salt or kosher salt that is crushed, and it's the finest form of salt. It's incredibly small, much like flour. Who makes salt? Well, the number one producer of salt is China. It's by a margin. China, there's a lot of mines in China. The second largest producer of salt is the United States, thanks to primarily two companies. Morton salt, which we probably all heard of, and Cargill, which some of you may not have heard of. Cargill is the largest privately held company in the US. They're responsible for a tremendous amount of food in the US and indeed around the world. And they have their hands in sort of a lot of things, one of which is salt production. And why do I have Tabasco up here? The primary salt mine for Cargill used to be owned, or is owned, by the McIlhenny family. McIlhenny, you may recognize if you've ever had a bottle of Tabasco. It says McIlhenny Company right on it. It used to be jointly owned, the salt mine. And it was on Avery Island in Louisiana. And that's where all Tabasco is made. They have a big salt mine there. So let's talk about sources. The primary source for the salt that we eat is lake beds. So you have, as I said before, it was a great question. You have evaporated seawater or salty spring water that is contained in an area, and then it slowly evaporates, leaving this layer of salt. And that layer of salt then often gets covered by some sort of geologic process and becomes in the ground. Almost all the salt that we typically eat, other than sea salt, is mined salt. It's not on the surface. Like, you can't just walk up to it and say, oh, look, salt. This didn't used to be true. Way back when, hundreds or thousands of years ago, salt was primarily found on the sort of the corners of salty water, and it was harvested there. Salt was a really precious commodity back then. Huh? The word salary comes from salt, because salt was so valuable it was used as a currency. It was actually started off to be used to pay soldiers in conflict. The second most common sources of salt, seawater, as you may imagine. How else do we get salt? Well, there's one other way. We can combine an acid and a base. As long as the acid and the base are water soluble, it will create salt, a salt, and water. So if we combine hydrochloric acid and, this is lye, two things that you don't want to drink, right? You get, if you get the proportions just right, you'll end up with just regular salt water. They'll combine. Salty trivia. Why do we add salt to boiling water? Why do we add salt to our water, like if we're going to boil pasta? To raise what? To raise the boiling point. Flavors the pasta. Primary reason, it just flavors the pasta. It does raise the boiling point ever so slightly. It's pretty small. It's just a couple of degrees. But the primary reason why we add it is just to flavor the pasta. So we add salt to our roads in the winter. We're from Illinois. We're from the Rust Belt. We've all seen rust on our cars or on other people's cars. That's primarily caused by winter salting of the roads. If you go down to Palm Springs, California, where I just was, you'll notice that all the cars are suspiciously devoid of rust. But up here, there's rust on many cars. Why do we salt the roads? Well, it lowers the freezing point of water, and it can lower it quite a bit. So a fully salted amount of water, that is water that holds as much salt as it possibly can, goes down to about -9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite a lot. But it's also why in very cold temperatures, we don't salt the roads, because it's not effective. So if you're salting the roads and it's -20 degrees, the salt won't help. The water will just freeze with the salt in it. Let's talk about how your body uses salt and why we need it. We talked a little bit about why we needed it before. So we need salt, but how much salt do we actually require? It turns out we don't need a lot at all. In order to survive, you only need a couple hundred milligrams of salt. That's about a pinch of salt a day. That's all that you need to survive, between 200 and 400 milligrams, depending on your body weight. But the average American gets more than 10 times that amount. A healthy amount is between 1 gram and about 2 grams per day, which is quite a bit. That's just over a teaspoon of salt. But we get much more than that. In fact, in some areas of the world, there's an area of northern Japan where people get 11 grams of salt per day, which is an enormous amount of salt, and has all sorts of health consequences. The primary reason is hypertension. That's high blood pressure. Why does it cause high blood pressure? Again, going back to that picture with the cell in the bath of sodium, it causes fluid retention. So water wants to go towards salt to equalize a balance. So we have increased fluid in our bodies, and that puts increased tension on our blood vessels. And when that happens, of course, increased pressure, increased blood pressure. Increased blood pressure leads to heart attack and stroke, primarily, as the negative health effects. How do we lose salt? Let's say we have too much salt in our body. How do we lose salt? Sweat. Boom. Easiest way to lose salt is through sweat. What else? Drinking? So you can reduce the level of salt, the overall level of salt in your body, by drinking water that doesn't have any salt in it. True. Also, tears and urination are the primary ways that we lose salt. How do we gain salt? Pizza. That's a smart audience. Pizza. We eat it. That's really the only way. The only other way is in a medical setting when you get that IV bag. That IV bag isn't just water. You wouldn't want to use just like distilled water because of that. Right there. If you use distilled water, you end up with less water outside the cell, or less sodium outside the cell than inside the cell, and the cell ruptures, which would be really, really bad. So that bag of saline is salt water or potassium chloride, but it'll contain some sort of salt in it. Why do we use, I forgot this one. Why do we use, what is salt substitute? Anybody know? Potassium chloride. You're exactly right. Why do we use potassium? Because it isn't sodium. Bingo. So here's sodium on the periodic table, and right next to it is potassium. We don't use lithium. That would be bad. Lithium has a bunch of effects on the body, but potassium is right below it and has very similar characteristics to sodium. So one of the primary scientific discoveries that was made several thousand years ago was that you could preserve food using salt. This was enormous. This allowed for all sorts of things. This allowed for, just militarily speaking, you could extend supply lines. You could have food in the winter. You could transport food for the first time, especially fish and meats. You could transport food from one location to another. Remember, there was no refrigeration, and ice was very difficult to come by, if at all. You could transport these foods from one spot to another. And because salt was difficult to come by in sort of the normal diet, adding salt to meats changed our health. It improved health tremendously, indicating that the people who were living several thousand, like 6,000 years ago, when salt was first cultivated from salty streams, were heavily deficient in sodium. All that changed when we started preserving food. But it started to have negative health effects as well. All life needs salt. Is that true? Yes. True. All life needs salt. It includes plants. Plants require a small amount of sodium to maintain balance of water in their cells. So I want to tell you a story about a group of elephants. There's a group of elephants in Elgon, Kenya, who have learned to mine salt. And it's pretty amazing. No, I'm not kidding. They have learned to mine salt once a year. They travel Kenya all around, migrating from area to area, but once a year they found a location that has salt in a cave. And so once a year, as generational knowledge passed down from one to another, they go to this cave and consume a bunch of salt over the course of a couple of days. And that's the only time in their diet that they get sodium. Just once a year, and that's enough to sustain them. I'm sorry? What do the elephants do that don't live in Kenya? So elephants that don't live in Kenya typically have either salty springs or salt licks, or they don't live in an area that's so sodium poor, like in the soil. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive. You need salt in order to live.
So would it suggest then that they can ingest enough that it can maintain them for a year? How does that process work?
It's stored in their blood. In their blood. So it's just stored in their body for that long. Their only significant source of of sodium. We're going to do a little experiment. Yay, experiments! With the help of my lovely assistant here, Scott. Let there be egg. Do you have a microphone?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, it's working.
Okay.
I just have to get very intimate with the microphone. I love you, microphone.
So I have this egg here, and this egg, as you can see, is denser than water. It falls to the bottom. But, I'm going to do that. Salt. Salt fully dissolves in water. What does that mean? It means that the individual atoms of salt break apart and they go free floating in the water. Just like the image here, you have sodium and natrium.
I'm going to add a little food coloring just to make it more visible. It doesn't do anything chemically to alter the experiment.
So you have sodium and chlorine here that get broken apart by water, and they sort of fit in between the atoms, the molecules of water.
Speak up a little bit, please.
Sorry, is this a little better? Is this a little better?
There you go.
Ah, there we go. So the salt gets broken apart and it fits in between the molecules of water. So we added salt to the wrong thing. I was supposed to show you that the level of water doesn't go up when you add salt. It may rise because of certain impurities, but the level of the water doesn't change when we add salt because it fits in between the little molecules of water. They do like each other. They're friends. So you can see now that when I add the egg, the egg floats. Why? If I added a jar of salt, what if I filled this with salt and just put this in the water? Would the egg float? No. It would still sink. So, it floats because the water got dumb. That's correct, it got dense. So, we've changed the density of the liquid. We've put little molecules in between the molecules of water. And that has changed the density of the water. Sort of the number of molecules per cubic centimeter, if you will, has increased. So that makes the egg float. The egg is now less dense than the newly formed liquid. Scott's going to work on this for a minute. Anybody have any additional questions? Why does Morton salt flow when it's humid? That's an excellent question. So Morton Salt did something for the first time. They put silicates into their salt. I don't think so. They put silicates into the salt. And they did that so that the salt would flow. Before, you had to deal with clumping salt. My grandmother didn't buy Morton salt, and the salt shaker at the table was always clumpy. And we would have to shake it around like this, and to get the salt free. And Morton salt solved that problem. The reason why Morton salt flows so well, especially when it's just after a rain, is because those silicates absorb water. So it flows even better when it's moist.
There's gotta be another question, I'm not done yet.
I saw one. Sure.
I understand that ultra-processed foods are very high in salt and they're a big part of the American diet.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that doing to Americans?
So the question is that processed and ultra-processed foods are a large part of the American diet. What is that doing to us? Heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure. Processed foods also contribute to certain forms of cancers, like stomach cancer and colon cancer. So it's a nice treat every now and then, but don't go too crazy. Scott's still working here. I saw one more question.
I was going to ask, a little while back when you were talking about salt and salt substitutes, and you were showing the periodic table designations of the different salts,
Uh-huh.
and sodium right above whatever else it was that was a substitute. So the question that comes to mind is, if you want to reduce salt in your diet for obvious reasons, and you replace it with another substance, which is also a salt, how does that solve the problem, replacing a salt with a salt to reduce your salt? You know what I mean?
Sure. So potassium gets eliminated from the body via a different mechanism than sodium does. Potassium gets eliminated in the kidneys and is highly regulated by the body. The potassium in our bodies, if the level gets off by even just a little bit, it can cause heart attack. Potassium is very important to heart health. So our bodies have different mechanisms for regulating potassium.
Does that mean potassium chloride wouldn't exit the body through sweat or tears?
I imagine it would. Still,
Leave the body, potassium?
yeah, sorry. The question was, does that mean potassium wouldn't exit the body through sweat or tears? I think it still would. So Scott's done here, and we can see he added colored water to the salted water. That's just water with no salt in it. And we can see that, in fact, the red water, which has salt in it, is significantly denser than the green water with no salt in it. So we really have changed the molecular makeup.
Does anybody have a hypothesis about what will happen when I put the egg in? Where did you go?
I know, all these smart people. And there it goes. It bobs by the red water. It's like Christmas. So salt was first discovered and mined. Not mined, it was discovered around salty pools, around 6000 BC. But it took quite a long time until 450 BC, until the first sort of salt works, the first mechanical way to derive salt from water was devised, and it was devised by the Chinese. This was the first use of natural gas, believe it or not, was because of salt. They transported this gas that exploded long distances in hollow bamboo shoots or bamboo trunks to salt boiling or water boiling, essentially plants, in order to make salt. First use of natural gas. This was scaled up some years later to be an enormous factory. And remnants of the sort of the outlines of this factory actually still exist. I could not find a picture of it. It's in China. So Gaul, what is modern-day France, parts of Germany, this is a salt-rich area, and it was believed that part of the reason why Rome and Caesar wanted to invade this area was because of its salt mines. There were other reasons, but part of it was because it was salt-rich. In the year 500, it was first used as a currency. Who knew salt would be a currency? That's a strange thing for us modern folks to think about, but it was first used as a currency in the year 500. The American Revolution, you know, it had something to do with salt. There was a tea tax, but there was also a salt tax that the British imposed. And this was part of the reason for the rebellion. It was very expensive to preserve food using salt. Remember, there's no ice at this time. There's no refrigeration. That doesn't come until like the early 1900s, where that becomes even close to widespread. So very expensive preservation of food was part of the reason for the American Revolution. It was also a reason for the French Revolution. The British taxed salt in France as well. And of course, there was a French Revolution about 10 years later. I guess it was about 15 years later. Salt first became really abundant in like the 1900s or so. That's when we see the salt prices begin to come down and its consumption go way up. And we see that mainly due to mining, the discovery of ways to find salt mines and to exploit salt mines changes significantly in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And we see increased salt use, especially through the 1950s, and that's when we start to see health problems. So it's been 70, 80 years that we've dealt with increased salt consumption, and it's still an issue. Did you know that there was a proposal at the World Health Organization to list salt as a controlled substance? So that each person would be allotted a certain amount of salt per day. It did not fly. No. It crashed and burned rather spectacularly. But the proposal was made at the National Health Organization. Thank you very much.
Probably buy some unseasoned.
Why does salt make everything taste better? So when sodium hits a taste bud, there's a little receptor on it for salt, and that increases the activity of the other receptors on that taste bud. It's actually a physical reaction that happens. So, right, it's a catalyst for flavor. That's why salt enhances everything. That's why you add a little bit of salt to ice cream and to meat and to onions and everything else, and why you can salt your salad. In fact, that's part of the word salad actually comes from the word salt, because the Romans used to salt their vegetables, and it was called a salad.
Many, many years ago, I saw the movie Gandhi.
Uh-huh.
And there was something in there about the salt harvesting being related to the independence movement. I wonder if you remember what it was.
That was another revolution of independence from Britain that happened in India, much like what happened in United States and in France. So India, the British started putting a bunch of restrictions on the export of salt. So it's much more profitable to sell salt than it is to mine salt. And for that reason, when they were exporting salt from India, they weren't permitted to refine it themselves. This was a significant portion of income for the British Empire. So because they weren't allowed to refine salt, that was a lot of money essentially just going out the door with all their natural resources, or that natural resource, also leaving. And needless to say, the Indian people were a little upset about that. I don't know all of the details. That's all I know about it.
From what I know, Gandhi was, he led a group of people and he walked to a salt place and he was actually collecting salt, although that was against British law at the time. So he was entering into nonviolent protest by doing this.
Yeah, they restricted the amount of salt that India could export to keep the price up. So collecting salt sort of without authorization of the government was not allowed.
So the British had control of the sale of salt because they had control of the sources of salt, and that's probably because they had a worldwide empire.
Right.
And what I'm wondering is, where were the sources of salt in that empire that they mined and then sold for a profit and revolutions happened? Where did they come from? Salt mines in India, or?
I imagine it came primarily from India, although, go ahead. Oh. I don't know all of the sources of salt for the British Empire. I know that India was a significant one, but it was tightly controlled.
So, following on the egg experiment, one of the things that Dave wanted to show with that is that there are different layers of salinity in the ocean as well. So if you've got different densities of salt water, more or less salty water, it forms literal layers in the ocean. And it can contribute significantly to currents. So whenever you have fresh water coming into the ocean, it dilutes the overall level of salinity. And as you can see with the egg experiment, fresher water, less salty water, floats on top of more salty water. Temperature also influences water density, and combined, temperature and salinity are largely responsible for creating and sustaining a lot of the significant ocean currents. So the saltiness of the ocean is responsible largely for some of those currents. Also, the salt in the ocean is from billions of years of erosion of these lighter elements from mountains and lakes and streams are a little salty, but that salt has nowhere to go except in the ocean. So the ocean accumulates it and then gets these salty layers in it.
Right, and the level of salt in the ocean changes during different times of the year. So the salinity at the poles, for example, changes significantly because of ice. The water comes together, forms ice. Well, all that water is locked up, so the salt is left. And so the salinity of the water at the poles increases and decreases throughout the year.
I was interested hearing about Boone Lick and all the different places that were kind of natural sources of
Boone Lake, Missouri? Boone Lake, Missouri was founded by Daniel Boone, or was discovered by Daniel Boone, or Daniel Boone's kids? Daniel?
I didn't know he was in Missouri as much as in Kentucky. Yeah, he retired in Missouri, actually. Oh, yeah? Many people do.
And it was discovered that a lot of animals were hanging around this area and were drinking the water and having salt licks on the surface. So it was a great place for hunting. And people could get salt in that area.
So I think salt cellars began, well, are salt then. So salt cellars began to be popular with, extremely wealthy people.
Mhm.
In ancient Greece, there's a tradition of them being extremely ornate, very decorative, often with, made out of gold and other fine metals. And so I just wonder where the salt came from in ancient Greece. There's a lot of salt cellars with a lot of water symbols,
I-
it came from the ocean.
I imagine it came from the ocean. They're surrounded by water. It is a nation of islands. I know that salt used to be so prohibitively expensive that it created a great deal of wealth. In fact, in its heyday, Venice, almost 50% of the imports and exports from Venice were either salt or salted foods. So it created entire economies around salt.
Yeah, that's hard to picture in some ways, in our modern mind.
Right, salt is everywhere now. Salt is even in foods that we don't want it to be in.
So when the separation between the two densities of water happens, what's actually preventing them from mixing? Is it just the density itself?
It's just the density.
There's no okay.
Yeah. If we stir it up, then they'll just mix together. But
Yeah, I know there's caves like in South America and other places that have like different densities of water. And when you go cave diving, it's actually like a point of safety because some people might not recognize
that they're in water. Yeah, they're called stratification layers of liquid. And sometimes in these caves, one area of water can be so dense compared to another that you'll actually come up and think that you're in air because the surface level of the denser water almost looks like glass. All right. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. I hope you learned something about salt.